Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. Today, we are here to take your questions on the special bye-week Q&A. No game for me to react to this week. Next will be Bolt Breakdowns episode Tuesday after the Dallas game on Monday Night Football once we are back from the bye. But this week, I thought I would take some of your guys' best Twitter, YouTube questions just to see how people are feeling during the bye week and, whatever people are talking about in Chargers land. So I'm sure we will get to a bunch of QJ and JC stuff that was asked today. But without any further ado, I guess let's jump into it. So I'll start with the YouTube questions first. I will try to kind of rapid fire through some of these if, the same question was kind of asked twice or stuff like that. But let's just jump right into it. At Enemy 805, is Allen officially a Charger for life? And if so, do we give him an extension? I would probably say yes at this point. I think they were just kind of hoping to see that he would stay healthy this year. He has, and really the organization at every step of the way, even when maybe Chargers fans weren't quite as high on Keenan Allen when he was injured last year or at various points in the past, compared to what the vibe is on him now. I think they were always behind him every step of the way, and I think you could probably expect some kind of extension next year to decrease that cap hit because of the 4 max restructures that they did. His cap hit is currently $34 million for next year, so I do think they probably work out some type of extension in February, March, around that time to get Keenan Allen, and his cap hit for 2023 a little bit lower. They're going to have to get a lot of cap hits a little bit lower given their financial situation next year, but yeah, that's about it. At Tony to Win 9457, what's up with Henley? Referring to Dion Henley, of course. Henley played 1 defensive snap against the Raiders. Since he's come back, he's played, I think, 14 and 16 special team snaps in the last 2 weeks, respectively. I don't know what the confusion from the fans is to some extent. I think that some people wanted him to play a bigger role or, maybe assumed the downfall of Kenneth Murray and thought maybe he'd get a chance to start, but Kenneth Murray's played real well when Eric Kendricks hasn't been in there. And clearly their linebacker sort of rotation right now, so to speak, is Murray, Kendricks, and, Nick Neiman contributing there as well. And Dion Henley's playing special teams. And when they drafted Dion Henley, Ryan Fickham was like, yep, that guy's going to be a core for, special teams guy for us. And so that's what he's been. And I think people, when it comes to the preseason and how well he played there, maybe expected him to play a little bit more in the regular season. But I think the Chargers are bringing him along at his own pace. And, you can probably expect, depending on what they decide to do with linebackers next year, with Kenneth Murray being a free agent and Eric Kendricks, going into the last year of his deal, although they can save money if they were to cut his contract based on how they kind of wrote it up as a 1-year deal. We'll see what happens next year. I do think he'll get to be more of a defensive contributor then, but for now, he's a special teams guy. And they were straight up from the jump when he was drafted that was always going to be the case. At Matt N7028, seems likely we'll only be able to keep one of Bosa or Mack next season. Which do you prefer, and who do you think they'll keep? Find this pretty relevant after a Max 6-sack game while missing Bosa. I'll be honest, I don't think there's any way that they cut Joey Bosa. If you look at the cap sheet right now, they do save, I believe, $10 to $11 million by cutting Khalil Mack based on the restructure that he did and him entering the last year of his deal. Joey Bosa actually produces $14 million in cap savings and $22 million in dead cap if they were to cut him next year. So he's the only one between the cuts of potential cuts, I should say, of Mike Keenan, Mack, and Bosa based on the restructures that they did that actually loses money. So I know people are frustrated with the injuries and the lack of playing time, but that's a situation that I think will come up more so in 2025 when his cap hit, I believe, is 25 million and they can save 18 million by cutting him with the dead cap only being 7. So that's a conversation that if he's injured next year and they feel like they have to move on or both sides just kind of want to move on at that point, then that can come into play. But to me, as much as it may frustrate fans with Bosa not playing right now or Bosa just kind of being in and out of games, in and out of the lineup, he's not getting cut next year. And so I also don't want this to sound like it's disrespecting the Mac game, because I think Mac had a fantastic game against the Raiders. But you also have to remember the larger sample size this season is that he had 10 pressures in his first 3 games without a sack, right? He did have the 6 sack, 9 pressure game. Give him a ton of credit. He was a beast against the Raiders, although the Raiders' offensive line certainly helped him by giving 2 blockers to Tuli Tuipulotu a lot of the time, and there being a lot of breakdowns in the Raiders' offensive line in general. And O'Connell holding onto the ball for 15 million seconds. It feels like back there, and yeah, probably did take a bunch of coverage sacks. But you give credit to Mac for that game. I'm just saying, in the grand scheme of things, I need to see more of a sample size before I'm like, oh well, let's just keep Mac and move on from Bosa, right? Because what we've really seen from Mac with the Chargers is he's still a really elite run defender, but he's regressed as a passer, and the larger sample size would bear that out. So, now if he goes over the next 4 weeks and he's balling out against the Cowboys and the Chiefs offensive lines, then I think there's probably another discussion to be had. But again, the macro decisions for this team that they should make on the guys that got restructured this year, to me, need more of a larger sample size for this season than just to say, oh, well, Mac had a good game, so now let's cut Bosa and keep Mac. It's just like, that's not how it works. I also still, like I said, don't think there's a way based on the cap next year that they cut Bosa and raise more dead cap by doing that, especially with what they've already done with JC, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, a little later in the Q&A. A lot of people ask QJ questions, so let's get into it right now. Liam on YouTube asked, do you think we see more QJ after the bye or more of the same? I, for one, do not think it's his fault that he hasn't gotten many looks. I think, again, the QJ thing, and it's similar to the Jackson Smith and Jigba thing in Seattle, right? JSN is behind Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf and the guys that they have there. And Geno Smith feels comfortable throwing to those guys, and JSN has 66 yards. And people are like, well, you drafted this guy in the first round. And it's the same thing with Quentin Johnston to some extent in Los Angeles, right? Now, I do think that there will be more of a connection after the bye. But in terms of I think people want to assess blame and be like, well, is he to blame, or is it Herbert, or is it more? And I don't really think anyone's to blame, to be honest. I get why fans are frustrated that they spent a first round pick on Quentin Johnston. It's like, well, Zay is contributing and Addison is contributing, but this guy is not contributing. It's like, well, he was drafted into a different situation, right? If you want to compare it to Zay Flowers was drafted into a situation where and Odell Beckham Jr. is at his age is in and out of the lineup, and that's his biggest competition to getting on the field. That's outside of that, the Ravens have Rashad Bateman and a lot of nothing else, right? So Zay was always kind of going to be a target hog there, versus if Zay was a Charger and he was playing behind Keenan and Mike for all of training camp until Mike got hurt, he'd probably be in the same position that Quentin Johnston's in. And in terms of the, gaining the trust from Herbert and all of this stuff, and Herbert not defaulting out of that read to try to target Allen and Williams instead of going for Johnston, right? But you've already seen some of that connection start to pick up. He's getting targeted slightly more in games, starting with the Raiders game last week. So look, I do think things will pick up, but in general with this situation, I would be more concerned if the metrics and the film and everything indicated that Quentin Johnston wasn't getting open. But that's not the case, right? The film indicates that he is getting open. Herbert will eventually target him. And eventually we probably won't have these conversations. I know it's asking for patience, which is a lot from Chargers fans. But, I remember I posted the top 5 offensive, defensive, and bottom 5 offensive and defensive Chargers performances on my Twitter from PFF every week. And people were shocked to see that Quentin Johnston was in the top 5 offensive performers, right? When PFF grades things like route running and release and yards per route run and all these things. It's like, the guy's getting open and Herbert's eventually going to find him. And when he does, things are going to get, start rolling between those two players, right? So I get where the frustrations lie. But ultimately, I don't think this is anyone's fault. I don't think that QJ has to bend over backwards to get Herbert's trust. I don't think this is as complicated as some Chargers fans are making it out to be. the targets will come, and eventually the receptions and the yards will come as well. Rayner asks, record prediction over the next 4 games. I'll say 2-2. That's just how I feel about this team right now. Would I be shocked if they went 3-1 and won one of the games against the Cowboys and the Chiefs? No, but I also wouldn't be shocked if they dropped a game to Chicago that they probably shouldn't drop, given how that offense the last 2 weeks has been humming with explosive plays, right? So, for me, the biggest thing that's going against me, like picking them to go 3-1 or 4-0 in this stretch, is the defense still. And I know that they played better against the Raiders. They played better against the Vikings to some extent. But again, like that was when you were getting nonstop pressure against the Vikings O-line and nonstop pressure against the Raiders offensive line and Aiden O'Connell, right? It's going to be a little bit different when you're going against the Dallas offensive line and Dak Prescott and the weapons he has, or the Chiefs offensive line and what Mahomes has there, right? So that is where the secondary is going to be more tested. And I still don't personally trust the secondary in its current state. I think it'll be a little bit better now that the JC thing has been resolved, which again, at some point we'll get to in this Q&A. But I feel comfortable saying 2-2. I could see them going 3-1. But for now, I would predict 2-2. So they're 4-4 after 8 weeks. At Eddie Dale Jr. asks, should the Chargers go to 5 edges next year to have multiple new guys learn under Joey? Not really. I mean, I think the 4-edge system is working fine, and they still have guys who are on the practice squad like Farmer and all these other players that they're, kind of keeping on their reserve/practice squads. Plus, on game days, you wouldn't keep 5 guys active anyway, right? You would keep 4. So, I don't know. I don't see the need for keeping 5 guys. Burley Johnson. Oh, sorry. Missed this question from Kirk Coleman. With how well Tuli has played these first 4 weeks, how likely are the Chargers to move on from Mac and or Bosa? Again, a Mac or Bosa question. I don't think Tuli affects much. I think Tuli would make you feel better about, having to probably cut Mac if, it comes to that financially, which it's probably likely to. But I think that, they were planning on doing that and moving on from probably one of their high-profile edges and one of their high-profile receivers before they drafted Tuli. So I think it makes you feel better about the whole process, for sure. But I think they were always going to do that before this breakout that we've seen from Tuli to Pelotu, which has been awesome to watch. Ike asks thoughts on the secondary. Do we need to make changes, or can they last the season going against strong passing offenses? I guess this is where we can get into some of the JC stuff after this Ian Rappaport report that he apparently refused to go into the game last week after Michael Davis hurt his ankle, which is certainly something. But look, I think the state of the secondary is this, right? They're going to get Derwin James back. I don't think Derwin James has been playing at that Derwin James all-pro level per se, but he's been playing fine. I think when he gets back, things should, even out there. Really, the question in the secondary to me is Michael Davis. And, I know now with the report that he injured his ankle against the Raiders, I don't want to hold that performance as much against him, but Michael Davis was not very good in the first 3 weeks of the season. In fact, it was a complete disaster against Miami, against Minnesota, and against the Titans with the Chris Moore big reception that was on him too. So, I know a lot of people want to cut him slack because he was going against Justin Jefferson, and Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill and so on and so forth. But he also had a bad game against the Titans that really shouldn't have happened. So I don't know. That to me is the key defining thing in the secondary. Now that JC Jackson is off this team, can Michael Davis return to his 2020, 2022 type of form and really find ways to kind of have some lockdown games like he did towards the end of last year? And I would say in the last 8 to 10 games, because it was kind of a similar situation last year where he had a little bit of a rough start, but then really figured himself out, I think, in the last 10 to 12 weeks of the season. And so that's what I'll be interested to see if he can do that this year. If so, with the way Asante Samuel Jr.'s played the last 2 weeks, if you combine that with, great Michael Davis performances on the outside as well, then I think the secondary will be fine, especially if the defensive line keeps, to some extent getting the same amount of pressures and sacks that they're getting. Probably won't do that against the Cowboys or Chiefs, but just in general, being in a top 10 sacks team, being a top 10 pressures team if they can. But yeah, to me, the secondary comes down to the play of Michael Davis and whether it's more like 2022 or if it's more like 2021. And we're going to find that out over these last 13 games of the season or so. Burley Johnson, do you think regardless of how well he plays the rest of the season, Murray will not be returning next year? I still think he's gone. I mean, I would have said that when they turned down the 5th-year option, but now they kind of have options, I guess, with how Kenneth Murray's been playing. I think it does depend a lot on who the defensive leadership is next year, right? If that's Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco, or if that's somebody else. I don't think Kenneth Murray will ever be too expensive for them to not be able to afford. I mean, I think he's playing well right now, which you like to see in the last 3 games. But also, like, unless you're Roquan or somebody like that, you don't really blow up the linebacker market, right? And the linebacker market has sort of still been at historic lows, being kind of the running back position of the defense, right? So, I think they can bring Kenneth Murray back. I don't think he's gone regardless. But it'll be interesting to see what they do. And like I said, I think earlier, Eric Kendricks is kind of on a 1-year deal, so to speak. It's a 2-year deal, but they save about $5 or $6 billion by cutting him. So, there's a lot of uncertainty in that linebacker room, and they're probably going, like I said earlier, going to want to play Dion in a bigger role next year. So it'll be interesting. Another Johnston question. Asthma 775. How bad did Keenan get robbed for second team All-Pro in 2020? Those numbers against each other are not even close. 2020, if I'm correct, was the year that Keenan hurt his hamstring against Atlanta. And then I think he was used as like a decoy in the Raiders game. But he had like 10 yards, and then he didn't play the last 2 games because the team was already like 6-9, 6-10, something like that. They were 6-8, and then he didn't play the last like 2 games, I think. But were they 6-8? I don't remember the record. No, they finished the season 7-9, 6-10. I don't quite remember. I think 7-9 because I think they were 3-9 and then they won the last 4 games. Anyway, I think Keenan finished that season with like 992 yards, something like that. I actually looked back on who the second team All-Pros were, and it was wild to see Cole Beasley in there with a 967-yard season. I totally forgot that was like an All-Pro year for him. I don't know. I don't think Keenan got jobbed out of it when you miss games. Like, it's hard to get All-Pro consideration, especially with how many other players around the league play all 16 games and put up numbers. I think you can make the argument for him over Cole Beasley, but I also don't think it was necessarily like an egregious choice given, his historic production relative to his career that year. So Ernie asks, the Chargers were able to run the ball effectively week 1 versus the Dolphins, but have since struggled. Do you attribute this to the teams they face, or is it due to Eckler not being available? Does it seem like run blocking is a concern for this offensive line? So I wouldn't say run blocking is a concern for this offensive line. Through the first 2 weeks of the season, they were 3rd in run blocking in the league behind the Eagles and one other team I can't remember off the top of my head. But, now they're 10th. But I think that more, again, has to do with the teams that they've played, more so than like the offensive line. Again, the Vikings blitzed 86% of the time. The Raiders were getting nonstop pressure. So yes, like I do think from that perspective, run blocking hasn't been as good as it was the first 2 weeks, but again, it's also matchup dependent, and the amount of teams that are going to send pressure and blitz, it kind of it mutes your ability to run. And from a the standpoint where I think they really miss Eckler from is just the ability to be a little bit more decisive when he runs. And I think Joshua Kelly, when he's used as a complementary back, understands like hitting the hole a little bit better. But when he's the lead back, I think it's a little bit of a murkier game, just in terms of him feeling like he has to do a little bit more than when Austin Eckler is on the field. And where they really miss Austin Eckler is pass blocking. They had 9 pass blocking snaps between Kelly and Spiller last game, and they gave up 6 pressures on those 9 pass blocking snaps, which is just not acceptable, right? And they also miss Eckler from a receiving standpoint too. The ability that a defense has to respect of Eckler to catch a screen and take a ball 40 yards, after the catch, like that's just something that they don't have to respect with Joshua Kelly or Isaiah Spiller or Elijah Dotson or any of these guys. So I think they miss all of those. They miss Eckler in the running game because he's a top 10 running back. Like, let's be real. But I think they also miss Eckler in all of the other stuff that he does for the offense. And if you watch the tape against Vegas, like the 2 players that I think they truly missed in that game were Mike Williams. Obviously, like his absence has felt noticeable, and also Austin Eckler. That's just been really noticeable in their offense. Woltz with an extend Keenan question. Like I said, could the Chargers just extend Keenan for 3 years, take $20 million off his cap hit, and spread it out the next 3 years on top of his contract? I don't know, again, the specifics. I mean, I assume we'll talk more with Arjun and people like that around free agency and when it's time to discuss contracts next year. But I did briefly talk to Arjun and asked him, like, could they lower his cap hit with an extension? And he said, yeah. So I think that's, again, like I said earlier, probably what's going to happen. At SoCal Slime, why did Slater not play up to expectations versus Vegas? Nitpicky, I know. So Slater had an ankle injury. He was on the injury report limited, I think, on Wednesday, Thursday, leading up to the Raiders game, full practice on Friday. So I think from that standpoint, probably was not feeling his best physically. But I mean, look, Max Crosby's really fucking good, man. I mean, even on that play where Herbert has that magical escape out of the pocket where he gets pushed backwards and then somehow still manages to stay on his feet and find Quentin Johnston as he's flushed out of the pocket on that incomplete pass that's Staley challenged and successfully overturned. That was a Crosby beating Slater rep on that play. So look, Crosby was giving the work to Pipkins, poor Pipkins, and Slater the whole game. That's just how good he is. He is a top 5 edge player that's going to create opportunities for his other defensive line mates with as much attention and gravity that you have to pay to him, right? That's going to open up opportunities for other people. And while he had 8 pressures, the rest of the defensive line had 17 pressures, partially caused by Max Crosby and, the absolute sort of entropy, if you want to call it that, and dysfunction that he brings to the rest of the, offensive line trying to deal with him. So, it was kind of an unusually bad game for Slater, but I'm also not expecting it to be an issue going forward, especially with the chance to heal up his ankle over the bye week. So we'll kind of, I guess, see where that goes from there. Dark Boston 3697. I love the way Kellen has been using Darius Davis in the backfield. Should we utilize his skill set more on gadget sweep plays? I think they already are. I mean, they've done sweeps with him. They've put him in motion, end arounds, and I think that stuff will continue. I think they'll also find other creative ways to use him outside of that because defenses are going to, key in on Darius Davis whenever he's on the field just because, it could be an easy setup for a gadget play. So I think the Chargers probably will go the other direction and try to utilize him on plays as we saw against the Raiders where he lines up in the backfield and is doing stuff like that too. So I think they'll try to diversify his usage in a little bit just so it doesn't get too obvious that they're going to run some kind of end around or sweep play, right? So I think that's what you'll see with Darius Davis going forward. Anthony Navarro, you think the secondary feels a little bit relieved about JC being gone? So let's talk about JC Jackson, I think, more extensively. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the secondary, JC did refuse to go into the Raiders game after he was a healthy scratch last week. And so that is kind of the big story going around right now from Tom Pelissero and Ian Rappaport. Michael Davis apparently hurt his ankle against the Raiders, and JC Jackson refused to go into the game, requiring Michael Davis to continue to play, which, even with how he had played the first 3 weeks, probably gives a little bit of context to why Michael Davis was struggling against Davante Adams more than he usually does. So, I think that gives a little bit of context there. And then, of course, JC not wanting to come into the game seems to have spelled the end of his Chargers career and them realizing they had to part ways kind of no matter what, which is a crazy situation. But I don't know if the secondary feels relieved. I don't think there was any personal animosity towards JC in terms of the locker room and the players. I think the coaching staff in JC, clearly came to blows over the last, year and a half. That data is out there. Those reports are out there. JC last training camp decided to have elective ankle surgery. Brandon Staley and the coaching staff, while they supported his decision, were it wasn't, essentially came out at a press conference and said it wasn't an injury, right? They did it. Brandon Staley called it a comfort level procedure. And then, in his second game as a Charger against the Broncos on Monday Night Football, after he had missed week 1 and week 3, Brandon Staley at halftime benches JC Jackson, right, in 2022. So I think throughout the whole process of the JC tenure, and this is no one's fault specifically, I think really the communication and lack of communication falls on everyone in terms of Brandon Staley, JC Jackson, and Tom Telesco. We're never on the same page since last August. And I think you just started to see that continue to boil over again and again and again, even leading up through his recovery this year, to playing in the games, and what happened against Miami and what happened when he was a healthy scratch against Minnesota. And then when he refused to go, at some point, I think it is largely on JC Jackson, but I do think that where Brandon Staley gets some of the blame here too is just this communication going back to last August was not good on either side, right? And clearly there was a discrepancy as to what both parties wanted. And so I do think both sides kind of share their blame in that. But yeah, I mean, look, hopefully things are better, like I said, for the secondary now. I hope Michael Davis, like I said earlier, kind of finds that 2022, 2020 form that he was in. But, to me, I think it's kind of business as usual because JC obviously didn't play the last 2 weeks anyway. So I think they're prepared to move on, especially after the bye. Probably will make practice a little bit better. Just that, that situation's kind of in the past now, so to speak. But, I think just from a coaching standpoint, there's also stuff about the support staff and sports performance staff regarding JC in Pelissero and Rappaport's report this morning. I'm recording this on Sunday. So, I think it will make things easier, but ultimately, shame it didn't work out and kind of puts the Chargers in a poor financial position going forward. And that's on Staley and Telesco too. So tough stuff when it comes to JC Jackson. But in terms of the immediate future, yeah, it's probably better. At Kurzman, why didn't Keenan get too many receptions last game? Was the de-keying on him trying to take him away? Justin Herbert got pressured 25 times. The offense, the game script was not normal. They started the game on the Raiders side of the field 2 or 3 times. So I just think it was a weird game script game. I don't think it was Keenan wasn't getting open or anything like that. I think ultimately it wasn't that. It was just a weird offensive game for everyone kind of in general. And that's something I think the Chargers will try to fix during the bye week too. But I think you'll see probably a much more normal Keenan game coming out of the bye where the Chargers have to traditionally, drive down the field as opposed to what they did in the first half against Aiden O'Connell and forcing turnovers and then kind of going cold in the second half, so to speak. So I think you'll see a much normal game script this week that gets Keenan more involved. Talked about Quentin Johnston already. Rut Dog. Once again, Derwin James is out and our defense gets better. Why is that? I feel like Staley is simplifying the defense, which makes them play better. Derwin is amazing, but he's trying to do too much and confusing the rest of the secondary. What are your thoughts? Like I said on the Khalil Mack thing, let's not draw too many conclusions about a game in which we played Aiden O'Connell and an injured Devontae Adams and a terrible Raiders offensive line. In terms of macro conclusions for the rest of the season, look, this defense still needs Derwin. They still need Joey Bosa, if they're going to be good this year. I think to some extent, having like Dean Marlowe and Raheem Lane back there in the secondary and just kind of like asking them to, do their job and like take care of what they're supposed to do, as opposed to like coming down to pressure in the box, or like, doing all of the, Swiss Army knife thing that things that Derwin James does, right? Do I think that simplifies the game plan a little bit? Yeah. But also, like, having worse safeties on the field than Derwin James probably is a bigger issue if you're playing Dak Prescott, if you're playing Patrick Mahomes, than it was Aiden O'Connell and everything that went wrong with the Raiders that game. And I admit that Derwin has not been his, all pro self. Got beat quite a couple times in the Miami game over the middle of the field. The penalties have been an issue. But again, like, this defense is not better without Derwin James. And that's why I think Chargers fans trying to draw too many conclusions from the Raiders game, when really it was an isolated game in which they were starting an NFL quarterback in his first NFL game. You probably got to chill a little bit in terms of drawing conclusions from that game. At the Donatello, due to Corey Linsley's long-term medical diagnosis, do we need to make center a top priority in free agency or the draft next year? Yeah, probably. Corey Linsley, I don't think is likely to play again this year, just in general. I think it's going to be tough. And, I again, until we know more specifically what Corey Linsley's dealing with, all the Chargers have said is that it's a non-emergent heart condition, meaning it's not immediately life-threatening, but that hasn't given us any other details as to what he's dealing with. Until we know more, there's probably not a whole lot to say, but I think you could have made the argument that they should have gone for offensive line in this year's draft and gone for some interior guy to kind of learn from Corey and some of these other things, right? But they didn't. I think they'll try to see what Will Clapp does the rest of the year too. If Will Clapp plays well, then maybe that changes some of those conversations internally in the building. But more depth is always appreciated there, kind of almost regardless of Corey's condition. But obviously, going forward, if Corey Linsley, depending on his football playing future, which may be up in the air, they probably do need a draft a center at some point. At Jacob Cantino 2702, will this team make the playoffs? Be honest, Alex. Good question. I don't know. I think they're kind of benefited in the AFC to some extent because, I mean, like, they would be in a better position in the NFC because the NFC is the weaker conference. But like, Aaron Rodgers got hurt with the Jets. The Jets are probably cooked. Outside of that, the AFC North teams are like all banged up injury wise. And I don't think any of their seasons have really gone how they want them to, although the Ravens seem to be kind of the clubhouse leader in that division, so to speak. But, I think the Chargers are probably disadvantaged by probably advantaged by what's going on with the Bengals right now, what's going on with, the Browns, right? Not looking quite as good as people expected those teams to look, with the amount of injuries and hits that those teams have taken. AFC South is probably a little bit better than expected in terms of like if you're evaluating some type of wild card race. But I, at the end of the day, I still probably would pick the Chiefs to win the division. Maybe the Chargers can change that conversation in 2 weeks. We'll see. But yeah, for now, I have them competing for a wild card spot. I'll say that as long as Justin Herbert stays healthy, they will make the playoffs. I predicted them to make the playoffs at, I think, 10-7 this year. 10-7, 11-6, I still don't think is an unrealistic finish for this team. But I also expected them to go a little bit better than 2-2 to start the season as well, given their initial schedule. But as we know, in the NFL, it doesn't always play out like that. And, you never know which teams are exactly, you never know which teams are going to show up on Sunday when you're predicting the schedule back in May, right? So, yeah, I'll say that they make the playoffs because I think that the AFC has toned down a little bit in terms of its difficulty and the amount of injuries that there are. But I don't think it's going to be like, oh, they're going to make, I don't know if they're going to be the 5th seed wild card like they were last year. And they make the playoffs pretty comfortably going into the last week of the season. It might be a little closer this year, but I mean, look, hopefully they compete for the division against the Chiefs. I just don't have expectations with that happening yet, but we'll see. Joe Alexander, with JC Jackson gone now, does keeping both Mike Williams and Keenan Allen seem more possible? No. Okay, here's the thing with JC Jackson, right? JC Jackson is going to produce a $21 million dead cap next year. So that's the situation the Chargers are going to be dealing with. Ultimately, I don't think that extra $21 million in dead cap is going to affect the Chargers that much, considering they were already planning on taking on a lot of dead cap when they restructured Mike and Keenan and Bosa and Mac to begin with, right? So they already knew. I mean, we've speculated on the cuts that might eventually come for Mike Williams and Khalil Mack. So they already kind of knew that they were going to be in this precarious position. I don't think the JC Jackson dead cap really changes their thinking. And certainly, like, JC Jackson being gone now doesn't give them any advantages financially. In fact, it disadvantages them. But I don't think it changes their outlook on keeping Keenan or Mike negatively or positively. Probably is a variable that makes them try to, extend some guys, cut some money some other ways with some of the other cuttable contracts next year to see if they can become a little bit more cap compliant. But ultimately, I don't think the JC Jackson thing really affects their plans on the big four guys that we keep talking about in the restructures, considering the dead cap they're already taking on. JC Jackson was the first. This comes from Israel Rangel 8112. JC Jackson was the first trade Tom Telesco's made. Can he make another trade to improve this team, safety personnel, or center position? I think Tom Telesco can make moves. I mean, look, we knew that the Chargers were publicly in to some extent on Chase Claypool. They did their homework there before Miami got him. Not that I was like a big proponent of going out and getting Chase Claypool, but I think with the amount of injuries this team has taken, and obviously with the JC Jackson situation, like, yeah, you can see them making a move at the deadline. And I think they're probably more likely to make a move at the deadline this year than they have been in previous years because of the amount of financial capital they have invested in this year. They got a little bit of 2023 money back in the JC Jackson deal to New England. So like, I don't think it's unfeasible that they make some kind of trade happen this year. I don't know if it's going to be for like a star. And I don't look like get Higgins and Pitts and Judy out of your head. Not happening under any circumstances to the Chargers. Like, let me just tell you that right now. First of all, Atlanta's not trading Kyle Pitts. Y'all got to stop going crazy on Twitter about that. But, when it comes to like the big money contracts to like take on as expiring deals, I don't think the Chargers are doing that. Considering they still have, Keenan Allen and most of their, high paid guys. So I don't think they feel the need to go do that quite yet. But, could we see them at some point like trade again for some more depth or do something at the deadline? I wouldn't be shocked. And I think this is the year with Tom Telesco acquiring an extra 7th round pick for Dustin Hopkins and having all of his draft trade capital, available to him. Yeah, they could make a move at the deadline. I just don't think it's going to be like the move that like fans on Twitter are looking for. I think it'd be more along the lines of like a Chase Claypool type of trade where it's just like, okay, let's build out our depth a little bit, get somebody that we think can contribute. All right, that does it for the YouTube questions. We still have a lot of Twitter questions to go through. This comes from BL De Bruin Lavois on Twitter. Do you think they'll try to rely on the run game more with Ekbak, maybe Everett involved too, without Mike and not as much 3 wide receiver sets? I still think they're going to do 3 wide receiver sets. That's just how they functioned with the Kellen Moore offense in terms of having, Keenan, QJ, and Palmer on the field more. I do think they did try to get Everett more involved in the Minnesota game, and he was. He was a little bit quiet against the Raiders, but I don't think that was intentional. Like, it's just a matter of whether you get the ball certain weeks or not. They like using their tight ends in the red zone, as we've seen with Donald Parham. And I think as we'll continue to see with Gerald Everett and Stone Smart and like all those guys, just because, again, the height advantage and the leverage advantage that you have there. But yeah, I think having Eckler back and hopefully having another week for the offensive line to get healthy should make the run blocking a little bit better, a little bit smoother than it's looked the last 2 weeks. And I think ultimately they feel more comfortable with Eckler bringing them home if they have to run on a drive in the fourth quarter than Joshua Kelly doing the same thing as we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So, Matthew, kind of the same question we just got, but this team is in a win now mode. Does Tom Telesco need a move to make at the trade deadline to save his job and Brandon Staley? I don't know if he needs a move. It's based on what do you consider a move to be, right? Like if you want that to be Higgins or Judy or Pitts or somebody like that, not going to happen. But do I think that they can bolster the depth at the trade deadline? Sure. So, we'll see. Ask at Austin McWalter, if you were GM, what changes would you make at the bye? I don't know if there's a ton of changes to be made. I think that they can try to experiment with things a little bit more, right? Like one thing that I point out on this team is that the tight end blocking as it's currently constructed isn't working now with Trey McKitty and Stone Smart and Donald Parham. They've all been pretty subpar blockers this season. They haven't used Parham as much as a blocker, more of a pass catcher in the red zone type threat, but Stone Smart and Trey McKitty have been bad blockers this year. Try to elevate Nick Van Nett from the practice squad and kind of see what you have there. I wouldn't hate that. Stevens pointed that one out. But ultimately, I don't know if there's a big macro thing you do as GM than just kind of ultimately change snap counts a little bit and play this guy a little bit more, a little bit less. But ultimately, we're talking about doing things slightly more in the margins than making some big move. At Pro Hater 2023 at Prandlemeyer Fanatic. Why do you think people wanted the Chargers to trade for Chase Claypool? I don't know if I think that's just how Twitter is oriented with trades, where it's oh, we could have gotten that guy. I was anti Chase Claypool from the beginning. I think that he is a low energy, low effort player in terms of blocking and route running, as we've seen towards the end of his Pittsburgh tenure and now at the end of his Chicago tenure. Look, Chase Claypool could be very good with the Miami Dolphins. How that offense is constructed with Mike McDaniel. It's explosive. And I wouldn't be surprised if Chase Claypool finishes the season with 350 yards and, makes his impact felt in Miami. But I also don't, I don't think the Chargers losing out on that trade is a big deal. I think they tried to make that trade work. And to me, ultimately, getting Chase Claypool in this offense wouldn't have been the difference between, a Super Bowl and not a Super Bowl, or a playoff berth and not a playoff berth, right? But I can see why the Chargers wanted to pursue that trade in terms of just getting a body in the receiver room because of the injury to Mike Williams. And he does fit their size profile and some of the other things that we talked about. At Nikki Down 26, we kind of answered this one already, but how does the JC Jackson trade impact the potential of us retaining players like Bosa, Allen, Mack, and Williams, who were obviously Max restructured last year? I don't think it does. As I've said, I think the JC Jackson trade adds another $20 million in dead cap. And I think they'll try to find ways to, alleviate that elsewhere on the roster as well with some of the other cuttable contracts, aka Sebastian Joseph Day. Eric Kendricks is another one where they can save some money. But ultimately, they were probably already planning on moving on from Mike Williams and already planning on moving on from Khalil Mack, given those two cuttable contracts and the net profit that they get from that. So I don't think JC Jackson makes it oh, we have to cut one more guy or we have to cut one fewer guy. It doesn't really work like that when they were already planning on this dead cap plan anyway. The JC Jackson thing will make things tougher around the rest of the roster, but in terms of those core four players, I don't think it changes much. Chosen Ghost, predict Keenan's end of the year stat line. So he's at 430 yards right now, and I think 3-4 touchdowns. Is that what he's at? Interesting. You could do the thing where you say multiply by 4, and so he ends up with 1,600 yards and 16 touchdowns or something. I think realistically, I'll say 1,200, which would still be really great for Keenan Allen, especially in year 11 of his career, which would be insane. I'll say he finishes with 1,200, 1,300 yards and probably 9-10 touchdowns. I think that's a realistic kind of number for him, especially given he might miss a week here or there with a hamstring or something that he gets nicked up with. But I still expect him to play at a really high level. I don't know if he's going to have another 200-yard game in him again. He might, just because he needs to, given the injury to Mike Williams. But I would say that's a relatively realistic like stat prediction right there. At Warden X on Twitter, will we end up having the money to sign like a Zont after we inevitably extend Slater? Yeah, if they want to extend ASJ, I don't think that will be a problem. I don't think he's going to command top corner money or anything like that. He'll get a nice contract bump from his rookie deal, but he's not going to be impossible to sign or anything like that. Stephen Gallard, looking at how every player has performed over the first quarter of the season, whose snaps are you looking to increase and decrease if you were TT or Staley or the starting roster, assuming everyone is healthy after the bye week? They've already started to like up Tule's snaps, right? So like that's not as much of a concern. The answer to this, like prior to Mike Williams getting hurt, would have been to up Quentin Johnston snaps, but they already kind of have to do that out of necessity. So I don't know if there's like a certain answer. Like I said earlier, I think Trey McKitty and Stone Smart have been pretty bad from a blocking perspective. So if you can break down their snaps and bring in another tight end from the practice squad or from some other team, I certainly wouldn't hate that. Maybe you call the Bears and are like, hey, is Mercedes Lewis available? Like, I wouldn't hate that. But just in general, like, I don't know if there's like a bunch of guys that you bring up or down. Joshua Kelly, as a result of Alston Eckler coming back, will go down naturally. And then I think you probably have to see how things go with Joey Bosa, who's coming back from the toe and hamstring injuries. If you're able to up his snaps throughout the year, that would be a big advantage to the rest of the defense as well, versus playing in this more like limited capacity with him. But ultimately, I don't think there's many guys that you're like increasing or decreasing their snaps as the season kind of goes on. But yeah, I don't think there's many macro decisions to make after the macro decisions that have already been made and injuries and guys that are coming back ultimately. At Meerkat Manor, if things go awry this season, do you believe that Tom Telesco should go? I understand the record during his tenure hasn't been great. You can't deny the talent this team has. I'm a little afraid of the grass is always a greener scenario with people asking for his head. I think here's the reality with Telesco and Staley. This is a make or break year for them, I think, because of everything the Chargers have invested into this year. We've already talked about the dead cap scenario with all the max restructures and everything that they've already done. They're kind of out of moves, right, with the Justin Herbert extension. And if they don't make the playoffs this year or they don't win a playoff game, like they're already going to have to recalibrate this roster in a significant way next year, as we've already talked about, with potentially Mike Williams not being back, Khalil Mack not being back, other guys not being back. So like this roster is going to look different outside of Herbert, Keenan, and like Joey Bosa and Derwin James and like some of those roster mainstays. Austin Eckler's probably not back next year. So like this roster, regardless of whether Telesco or Staley are back, is going to look different. The question is, with all the money that they've sunk into this roster and borrowed from future seasons, like, do you still believe in the vision? And that will be determined by their success this year, right? Like if they go on some AFC championship type of run and make a deep run in the playoffs, then like, yeah, you probably give Telesco and Staley the benefit of the doubt and like continue on with them. But again, if they don't make the playoffs, like ultimately this management like is spending a lot of money on this roster, right? The Chargers, have been accused of being cheap in the past and all these things. But ultimately they spent a ton of money on this roster. They're going to have a lot of dead cap next year. And the people responsible for that, although yes, the JC Jackson thing is not their fault, right? Everyone is kind of involved in that blame, including JC. He's part of the reason they have another 20 million in dead cap next year. He's part of the reason that the reset is going to be, even harder to do on this roster than it already was. So, the reason that I think this is a make or break season for Telesco, outside of like, oh, this is his record in 10 years, or this is his playoff success in 10 years, et cetera, and the common things that fans bring up, is that like they've already kind of pushed all their poker chips in for this season, and all of their moves are kind of done. And so, we're going to have to see whether that ultimately, pays off. But if it doesn't, do you really want these two guys as your decision makers going forward without a playoff win or without the team performing like it should for a team that's going to be $100 million in the dead cap next year, right? Like that's going to be the crucial question for the Chargers to answer based on how they perform the rest of the year. At Matlock Season, Will, always there on the Twitter Spaces, talked about a lot, but we have seen this defense struggle against bad teams with their star players. Why do we play better without star players? I think this is talking about the simplifying the defense thing and Derwin and some of these other things. Why do we play better without star players? Again, I think that people are making the mistake about taking too much from the Raiders game. Again, that's not to take credit away from Khalil Mack or not to take credit away from the guys that played really well in that game, including ASJ and even Raheem Blaine and Dean Marlowe and like some of the safeties that had a good game. But it was also a beneficial game for them, right? Like ultimately, do you want less defensive talent to play against Patrick Mahomes? Do you want less defensive talent against Dak Prescott and the Cowboys, right? No. I think people also think back to the Miami and San Francisco games last year, right? As to like, oh, well, this team was really shorthanded and played really well and made the San Francisco game competitive and made the Miami game competitive. And I think that's due to Staley's credit as a play caller to some extent on the defense to some level, but also like Miami was not that good after Tua consistently got injured week after week, right? It wasn't like they were playing week 1 to 4 Miami against last year when everyone talks about the great game that Staley had, which I think was really good, but also like, there's extenuating circumstances there for Miami as well, given how the rest of their season played out after their hot start and Tua got injured. And then I think you look at San Francisco, like, yeah, Jimmy G was playing hurt also. And like that offense prior to Purdy coming in and prior to, Shanahan getting to hit the reset button on the Jimmy G thing a little bit looked really bad at points last year. So, I think that when you apply that to the San Francisco game last year as well, it makes it look a little bit, less impressive, right? Is this Chargers team down, Derwin James and Joey Bosa playing this current Purdy San Francisco team, like, and and doing really well defending them? Probably not, but they did really well against the Jimmy G Niners last year when they were having trouble moving the ball, right? So again, I do think the Chargers and Staley do simplify the game plan a little bit when they have stars out, but I don't think it's as simple as, oh, well, they play better without their stars. Like you also have to consider what are the extenuating circumstances for the other teams as well in the matchups that we tend to give the Chargers credit for doing better in those games without their own stars, so to speak. Let's see. At Nate the Mediocre, will we see Mike Williams in a Chargers uniform again? Man, this is tough. I have covered the Chargers for 7 years, through Bolt Beat, through GAC, through everything, and Mike Williams has been here since he was drafted in 2017. I started writing in August of 2017 last year, and it would really suck, honestly, to not see Mike Williams back with the Chargers. I think the pure financial realities make it a no. But I really hope, honestly, that there's some way that they can bring Mike Williams back. As of now, I don't think there is, given their cap situation and some of the things that they already determined before this year. Plus, he's coming back from an ACL injury. But Mike Williams, I would honestly be really heartbroken if he left, because he has been one of the most fun Chargers players to watch. Obviously, everybody has the memories of the Kansas City game and some of the other things that we talk about with him. The Cleveland game from a couple of years ago, the Pittsburgh touchdown a couple of years ago on Sunday Night Football. Some of the big games that Mike Williams has had in big moments. The Herbert throw against the Eagles, and Mike Williams is on the receiving end of that. So there's so many Mike Williams moments you can name over the years of big plays, and it would really suck to kind of see him go. But I think probably with the Chargers financial situation, yeah, he's probably not going to come back, unfortunately. This is one of our last questions from at Nick Skipper. Uh, I understand that we have our starting three cornerbacks and Dean Leonard, uh, and also Isang Bassi. But with the departure of J.C. Jackson and the loss of Williams, would this team be making open to making any midseason trades for a playoff push, even if they are Telesco specials? Look, like I said, I think that they can make some in-season moves to kind of bolster the depth on this roster. I don't think they're going to be, again, what everyone wants them to be. Like I posted, wide receivers the Chargers could go after, like, in terms of trying to bolster the depth there. And I mentioned Darnell Mooney, right, who was on an expiring contract in Chicago. You could, sign Julio Jones and see what he's got left in the tank. And everyone's like, oh, Julio's washed and Darnell sucks. And I'm like, yeah, but like those, you're taking chances like on those kinds of players, like at this stage, right? Again, you're not getting T. Higgins or Judy or any of these people, right? Like that's just not how the Chargers are operating. And I don't think the Chargers would be the team to receive any of those players given their cap situation and given their current position that they're in. So, if you're just trying to find ways to kind of bolster the depth on the roster, I think you have to consider all the other alternatives, whether that's free agency, the practice squad, whatever it might be, trades. And it's probably not going to be for the sexy players like that you want. But if you're trying to, make some Telesco special moves, I can see them doing that, especially with, again, some of the cap space they've cleared this year for the JC Jackson trade. And maybe as things get closer to the trade deadline, they get a little bit more active, especially if they are a little bit more hampered, a little bit more injured as we get to that point after the Dallas and Kansas City games. But hopefully they stay healthy and hopefully get some wins in those games too. It'd be nice to see. But that'll do it for this episode of Bolt Breakdowns, guys. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for sticking around. If you can't tell, this episode was recorded before all of the Sunday games. I have not watched any of the Sunday games. I have not watched Dallas or San Francisco or anything that's happened today. So, this is recorded on Sunday morning. So we'll see what happens in those games. We'll see what happens with the Chargers next week. As I mentioned, my next episode of Bolt Breakdowns will be next Tuesday after the Dallas Cowboys Monday Night Football game, which is going to be huge. Huge opportunity, huge potential for the Chargers to kind of have a prove yourself game on national television. I'm going to die over these next 4 weeks because they play 3 primetime games in those 4 weeks. Shockingly, one of them is not the Chiefs and is instead the Aaron Rodgers-less Jets on Monday Night Football. But I'll also stay up for that one too. Stay tuned for Bolt Breakdowns, guys. Love you guys. Thank you for all of your questions. It was fun to do this as a mid-season exercise to see where we are. And as always, bolt up.